Hi, so today I have something very special in store for you. I will be interviewing the fine art photographer Lance Lewin, who is Atlanta based and who is a member of the Kennesaw City Art and Culture Commission. Lance and I started talking because he commented on my video on urban aesthetics, what makes cities beautiful. And he actually reminded me of Junichiro Tanizaki's work in Praise of Shadows, which I then incorporated into my next video on Asian cities. So Lance and I started corresponding, and we came upon the topic of photographing cities and the question, what distinguishes the photography of cities produced by travel influencers and that of artists? All that and much more is coming up in the following interview with Lance Lewin. Thanks, Lance, for meeting me and for being the very first guest on my channel. And
That's great. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, T.
yeah, so you are, beside being a photographer and an instructor, you are also a member of the commission of the Kennesaw City Art and Culture Commission. So
Mhm.
could you tell us a little bit about this job and what are your tasks in this commission?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first, as an entire group,
Yeah.
we're there's about seven of us on the committee, and we work under the direction of the mayor of the city,
Hmm.
and we try to bring the arts and culture to Kennesaw. So again, this is specifically our little city
Hmm.
in North Atlanta.
Yeah.
And surrounding cities have a great exposure to First Friday Art Walk, and they have a lot of shows and performances. And we want to bring that to Kennesaw, which we kind of lacks in that. And one of the things we do is in the parks and recreation areas, we've put up some of the projects we have are installations, and they are art poles or colored rocks
Hmm.
where participants come, children, adults, and they could paint rocks and then take it with them or put them back. So it's an interactive installation, which is a lot of fun. But
Cool.
what I'm most excited about is I took lead on bringing live music to downtown Kennesaw,
Wow.
and that's really important. I think that's going to bring foot traffic in, and it's a win-win situation here. So we're looking to entertain people, but at the
Hmm.
same time, once you get foot traffic into Main Street, then
Hmm.
they visit the restaurants and the shops and hopefully grow their businesses. And of course, in return, the more business the vendors have, the more tax dollars or revenue is produced for the city. So it's a win-win that way. So that's what we do, and we're real excited about it.
Cool. So more culture, that's always great.
Hmm.
Yeah. And more art, obviously. So
Yes.
when we first met, we actually started talking about your technique of visualization that you implement when you teach
Hmm.
photography. And you take
Yes.
your inspiration from one of the photography's greats, Ansel Adams,
Hmm.
who said, and I have a quote here, the term visualization refers to the entire emotional mental process of creating a photograph.
Hmm.
And like when you were writing to me, you commented that for you, visualization is not just about the visual, it's about kind of awakening all of the senses to the scene and using them to capture it. Um,
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, it started back in many years ago when I was between 9 and probably 12 years old. And we lived in Brooklyn, New York.
mhm,
And we moved to the country compared to where I was living in Springfield, Pennsylvania.
mhm,
And we lived right behind the woods. And this is all new to me. I came from the projects in Brooklyn to this, beautiful green covered landscape. And it was during my hikes, my early hikes between 9 and 12 years old, that I just started smelling the air. In other words, I became so aware of all my senses that I started becoming aware of things we normally don't notice in our hurried pace.
Mm.
Um, I was listening to the wind going between the leaves and the branches. I could smell the different flowers and plants. And in fact, the strong scent of dried leaves or fallen leaves on the soil. And it all came together, and I could just see things better. I can almost taste the air, as a matter of fact. So I'm using all my senses. So in visualization, even when I'm going out into nature, this is what I do. I take the time to relax and breathe slowly and take all those all that stimulus comes into my system, and it's a very, very strong creative resource for artists, and especially for photographers. When I'm photographing urban landscape, well, a similar process, except instead of smelling the trees and seeing the water going over rocks at a creek, you are in the middle of the hustle and the bustle and the sounds of the large city, or maybe the deafening silence of a small country town. Each of those has their own characteristics, and
Mm.
again translate to the creative process and how you look at that scene, how you look at that landscape, and capture an engaging narrative, a visual narrative. Yeah,
You let yourself be inspired by the sounds and the smells and everything when
yes,
you're composing a photograph,
exactly.
and express exactly that mood that's there.
Mhm.
Um, so in one of your comments on my one of my essays or video essays on urban aesthetics, you mentioned Tanizaki's essay in praise of shadows, where he describes Japanese aesthetics by contrast to Western aesthetics, where we kind of like to have these light flooded cities. And he says in Japan, people actually appreciate these dark corners, these layers of darkness and shadows. So then I went and reread the essay because I had forgotten about it. I
Yeah,
hadn't yet read it years ago. So
it's a fabulous book.
yeah, thanks for reminding me. And
Sure.
then I also I included it in my video essay on Asian cities.
Yes, that was great video, by the way.
Thanks. So I wanted to ask you, what does this essay mean to you, and how do you relate it to the art of photography? Because photography, the very word means light writing or light
That's right.
drawing, but it's actually, you could reversely see it as painting with shadows. So I can see that it might have a very special significance for a photographer.
Yeah, absolutely. Normally, um, we don't easily see. We're programmed to look at the things that are illuminated by bright white light, and that's what um, in Praise of Shadows was bringing to the attention. When in Western culture, that's what we look at, and in Eastern culture, they sort of like back off of that and they look into the shadows. And that's a very, very interesting concept, and that's what I started doing. And the shadows, actually, I'm more illuminated, if you will, by looking at the shadows, and I look at the bright areas secondary. So I'm sort of like switching it around.
Mhm.
And when you start doing that, you could see a lot of beautiful, beautiful lines and shapes within subjects that you normally wouldn't see that. So the very mundane or commonplace objects or subjects become a lot more interesting. Um, uh, there's a Japanese aesthetic known as wabi sabi, and I recently, in the last year or two, started studying wabi sabi. Wabi sabi basically means what I was just saying: to become interested, to look at and enjoy the understated, even the dying, like the dying flower, where you
Mhm.
wouldn't even think of going over and taking a picture of a flower that's wilted. But in fact, depending upon its environment that it's sitting in, could be really beautiful in a certain way.
Mhm.
And that's what wabi sabi is. And then when you study wabi sabi, then you understand how to look at shadows in a more creative way. So maybe Tanziaki said it best in his praise of shadows. And what is this quote? Were it not for shadows, there would be no beauty.
Mm. Wow. Mm. It's really fascinating. Um, and your own photography of architecture uses these dark black and white contrasts and
Yes.
shadows, and it reminds me very much of also Alfred Stieglitz's New York photography. It seems that you are both interested in the shadows these buildings cast just as much as in the buildings themselves.
Yeah, that's a great observation, T. Yes. Shadows, we're talking about it. It's a very creative structure or component for the photographer behind the viewfinder. Um, Again, it's something that is not common. You don't just go out and see that. So it's very, very important that photographic artists spend more time and think about looking at shadows. Um, in architectural subjects, it's very, very important to find the lines and shapes and textures and see how they can just juxtapose to the line shapes and even the level of luminosity of the shadow in such a way as you can get a very, very um, uh, interesting and creative, again, aesthetic or narrative. Um, Let me make a note about Stieglitz. I think actually, I feel like more of my architectural work, and a lot of it is abstract, is more like Minor White. Minor White lived between 1908 and I believe 1976. And uh, his work used a lot of, but in any case, Stieglitz, I love Stieglitz. Stieglitz is my hero. So Stieglitz is the one that pushed for photography to be a proper art genre. And later on in the first decade of the 20th century, he changed to uh, stopping, he wanted to cut down on manipulation in creating pictorial photography. And I love that about him, using more natural means behind the viewfinder to create photographic art. So yeah, so he's a big fan of mine, Stieglitz.
Okay.
Don't get me started.
Yeah. So could you say something more in general about how you approach photographing cities when you are in a city? Like, how do
Yes,
you, yeah, the
absolutely.
process of that? Yeah. Mm.
Sure. So cities, and depending upon the city, so you have an urban landscape, it could be in the
Mm.
country, and it could be like in New York City.
Mm.
And actually, it's a long-term process. And COVID, of course, the pandemic shut me down for this whole year. It's called The Footsteps of New York City. The original title was The Footsteps of 42nd Street. And what I was doing is, instead of having my camera pointed up like we all do, I started pointing my camera down, and
Mhm.
I'm shooting people's movements and how
Mm.
we interact in the street. But at the same time, um, I also take pictures of the architecture there, the structures, the bridges, and going back what we said before, I really do get into the mood. So the sirens, the streets, you hear the cars going by, the trucks, people talking, the hustle and the bustle, the people going by. And again, just like being in the forest and getting inspired by the smells and the sounds of air and water going over rocks, I get inspired by listening to the people, to the trucks, the cars, saying, wow, look at this. This is absolutely amazing. Looking up and looking at these tall structures, so many of them are mixed in their texture, the old brick and then the
Mm.
modern steel and concrete, all juxtaposed. in like the same area.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very, very inspiring for photographic work. Absolutely, and that's what I do. And then again, the shadows. I go at different parts of the day. I'll go there early in the morning where there's less traffic, so that's a whole different mood. So depending upon what time of the day you go and the amount of traffic, or rather in general the activity that's happening, changes the way you look at particular structures, or the way you're going to look for shadows in this case. If it's quiet and it's calm, then you're going into the back alleyways. And then for me, in the middle of the day or near the late afternoon, when it gets very, very busy, I enjoy looking at the tall buildings. And though I might be looking at shadows there also, it's just a whole different perspective as compared to the more intimate, close, maybe even abstract shots that I try to get. So I hope that helps you.
Yeah, wow. I'll try to do that when I next go out to photograph.
You have to, and
Just really
show me
get into the
examples.
mood.
Show me
Yeah,
examples.
sure. Well, I'm sure you know about this trend of travel influencers, and
Oh, yeah.
there's a lot of, it's really trending to have these pictures of urban landscapes on Instagram, and we have, like, every day we get so many on our feeds, like we're bombarded with these stunning images.
We are.
And I wanted to ask you, what do you think of this phenomenon, and how does a travel influencer's approach to creating images differ from an artistic approach that you practice?
Sure,
Mm.
absolutely. I think one of the main differences is the images posted by the travel influencers, or travel influencers,
Yeah.
is they identify subjects which align with commercially oriented clients, and even the end product, which would be your family or your solo traveler, um, is completely different from it. They are not going out there to create thought provocative narratives, visual narratives. So it's completely different way of looking at the scene. Make no doubt about it, their pictures are beautiful, but they are not the types that a collector would say, hey, let's look at this. This needs to be in a gallery. This needs to be in an exhibition. Or to the private collector, oh yes, I need pictures like this to hang on my wall. It's just not going to happen. I think it's completely different. It has its place. So in the short answer would be no. I don't think the travel photographer or the travel influencer has a very, very big impact into the collection of art to
Mm.
the collector. So 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 that's my feeling on that. The
Yeah.
work is beautiful, but
Yeah.
it's not fine art photography.
Yeah.
It's more commercially aligned with the commercial side. They're
Mm.
more relatable. They're relatable to everyone's travel fantasies.
Yes.
And fine art photography is something else completely different.
Exactly. In philosophical aesthetics, we have this distinction between intrinsic value and instrumental value. And someone like, for instance, the philosopher Immanuel Kant would say that a work of art has intrinsic value. It is an end in itself. You produce art for its own sake, or you collect art for its own sake. Whereas something with an instrumental value is not a work of art. It's a different type of object. So even if the picture looks similar, it is a different type of object because it has a use that's outside of itself.
Hmm,
We, like, a travel influencer uses this image to build influence, to monetize this influence, and
that's
it's not
correct.
about the object as much,
That's exactly
about the
correct. That
image.
makes
Yeah,
a lot of sense. Yes.
that's some just an interpretation from a philosophical angle, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to answer some questions, and
Sure.
we'll be in touch. All the
I
best.
hope we
Yeah.
get to do this again. This was a lot of fun, T. And
Yeah.
yeah, this is absolutely wonderful. So I hope we come back and talk about some other subjects next time around.
Yeah, sure. And I'm looking forward to any of your future ideas and projects. Thanks.
Fabulous.
All
Enjoy
the
the rest of your
best.
day.
You too. Bye.
Take care.